From Flourish DX School, this is the Flourishing at School podcast. With mental health becoming a global priority, we are your partner for creating schools where students, teachers, and school leaders feel good and function well, becoming the best versions of themselves and contributing to a flourishing world.
Welcome to the Flourishing at School podcast. I'm Tamara Lechner. Each week, my co-host Jason Van Schie and I bring you the best practitioners, academics, and everything in between in order to inform best practice in whole school mental health. Now, Jason, I think finally you are back in Perth and I'm back in Victoria after traveling all over the place. You were in London and San Francisco, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right. I think this is the first time we're recording the podcast where both of us are actually home.
It's so true. And I usually like to start anything like this with a quick well-being check-in. And I've got to tell you, I was thinking about my well-being today and I feel like wobbly jello, like I'm not quite set. And so I hope everything goes spectacularly in this recording. And I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask our guest when I introduce her as well. So if you were rating your well-being on the jello scale from totally wet and not congealed to like hard jello, where are you on the well-being jello check-in?
I'm getting on the fully formed jello. I'm getting closer now. As you mentioned, I did do London and San Francisco, and I did that in pretty quick time. So a few days like travel, and then back to Sydney for a week with the family, and then back to Perth. So 3 weeks on the road, living out of a suitcase, a lot of jet lag, but finally 5 days back in Perth, and I'm feeling more myself and harder jello now. So
I love that. And I'm so excited for today's guest, Sharon Russell. And in a minute, Sharon, I'm going to ask you what kind of jello you are, but I want to introduce to our audience who may not know Dr. Russell. Sharon and I know one another from her work at the Shipley School, but she's actually been involved in social emotional learning since 1995, and I didn't even know it was a thing in 1995. She has worked as a health teacher, a counselor, and she has earned a certificate and a doctorate in school psychology. And she was involved in the academic and emotional support of students at the Shipley School, and she has been a massive part of bringing positive education to that school, and we're going to unravel all of the stories about that. But first, Sharon, I want to ask you, what kind of jello are you today?
I am good jello. I don't know whether you like wobbly or hard jello, but I am probably 7 or 8. We actually had the day off today. It's one of the Jewish holidays. So it was nice to kind of get a midweek sort of sleep in, not have to race out and, kind of take my time. So yeah, I'm feeling kind of relaxed and and ready to go.
Well, and I love that you actually asked what kind of jello, because I don't actually like jello at all.
I don't either.
Just to get that out there.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I know Sharon as well from some of the work that we've done with Shipley School, but even for, I think, probably 4 or 5 years before that, Sharon, I think we were already communicating and seeing each other at conferences and that sort of thing around the place. But you go even further back, I think, Tamara, with Sharon.
I'm trying to think of where we have met so many times. The most memorable one is at the last conference before the world shut down, pre-COVID, the NACE conference. But I feel like it's not 1995, but we've known each other for a long time.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, Sharon, at the top, Tamara gave us a brief background into who you are and what you've done professionally. But I guess in rapid fire in a few minutes, could you maybe give us and our listeners a bit more of an understanding of your background?
Sure. So as Tamara said, I did start teaching and writing a social emotional curriculum way back in 1995. I've started to joke now that I was 10 when I started. I was a prodigy, but I don't know how long that joke will continue. But we were really early on in adopting social emotional learning. I was a social worker by training when I came into that position, and the head of school at the time at Shipley had a master's in counseling and believed really strongly in supporting students and meeting them where they are at. And when he described the job, I told him he needed a social worker for the job, which looking back, it's hard to believe the things you say when you're young, but I think it was true. And so we worked on that curriculum. It was a high school program, which not many schools even today do. So many of the programs are focused on younger children. So we're really proud of that work, and that every student was taught this curriculum every week in our high school. And high school is the hardest place often to get, we often use the term real estate, to get the time and space. So getting that, and then we eventually worked the whole program pre-K through 12. And so I was, working with that whole program. And then I was in public school for about 7 years as a school psychologist, which I love. I love doing testing, psychoeducational evaluations, and had always really focused on strengths in those reports and got kind of the sideways look like, why are you talking about that? That's not what we do. When we work with kids, we want to know the deficits. Do they qualify for IEPs, they're called here, and 504 plans? And so I realized I was searching for something else, and Shipley invited me to come back in the role of Director of Student Support. And we did a few years of work with the Yale Center for Emotional Learning, which was amazing, just bringing in their work into our curriculum and piloting a program. And then in 2015-16, we had the good fortune to have Marty Seligman, Dr. Seligman's children, his two youngest, enroll at Shipley. And the oldest forbid him to be involved, which was interesting when you've got kind of the father of positive psychology, but he has to slip in the back door to have meetings with you. And we started talking about, his approach and what he brought to that field. And then he led us to Alejandro Adler, who I think will be on this podcast fairly soon. And Alejandro did one of our first talks on positive psychology to our faculty and staff. We were lucky enough to also have James Pawelski come and talk to us. And that's really where I would say the whole school journey into looking at positive psychology, positive education, how we could build beyond the work with the students. And I will be honest and say I was not someone who looked forward to doing this work with the adults. I really had a lot more experience working with the students. And so Alejandro told us, the folks from Geelong told us, you need to work with everybody. Everyone has to be on board. I even had this meeting set up with Sir Anthony Selden in London, and he told me the same thing. And I thought, okay, everybody is telling us you need to work with the adults. And so we started that in 2017 with Alejandro Adler and his team, training our whole faculty and staff in positive psychology. And, it's been an up and down road. COVID made things a challenge for, bringing in anything beyond kind of the day-to-day survival in schools. But I do feel like that foundational work we had done really did help us get through the pandemic. We collected a lot of data, and, yes, people were having a hard time at certain points, but I do think our foundation from all those years and then bringing the adults into the picture over the last, I guess it's 5 years now, has been something that has been hugely beneficial to the school. And that's what we continue to do. And I continue to work on working on student support pre-K through 12 at our school, and also working on positive education. We're throwing around, do we call it flourishing, thriving? Right now we're using them all terms synonymously. So that brings you right to October 2022.
Yeah, amazing background, Sharon. And, what a privilege to be able to work with some of the, the foremost experts in the field of wellbeing in schools, with the likes of Seligman and Adler and Pawlowski and all the rest. And, there's, you probably also, like, my background's organizational psychology, and, you have a close connection, or at least the school does, with probably one of the most famous organizational psychologists going around as well, who spoke at your school recently, I believe.
I assume you're talking about Adam Grant. Yes, he will be doing, it's actually next week, with some work with our colleagues on one of our professional development days. So, yeah, he's amazing. One of my favorite podcasts to listen to. Has such great insight on thinking. So we're so fortunate, to have him do that talk for us and answer some questions about our culture and how we can continue to, be open-minded and build on our strengths and, all the things we've been talking about.
Yeah. So Pennsylvania seems to be the place to be if you're a school looking to engage experts around wellbeing.
Yeah. I agree.
I'm curious, Sharon, because you've mentioned a bit bringing the adults into this, and for our listeners who are brand new to this and might be thinking that those adults are parents, and you did mention the staff and then you've got teachers. I'm curious to know what this plays out like in a day, a week, a month, a year at Shipley. I know that you work together with Nick Holton, and so you're working in timetabled lessons in class and professional development and communicating with parents. How do you keep all those balls juggling?
Yeah, they are a lot. And I would say, our focus, because it has been our backbone and our infrastructure, is the student work we call it SEED, Social, Emotional, and Ethical Development. That's the course we teach once a week, pre-K through 12, to every student in the school. So that's where we've really, that's where we do our direct instruction with the students and engage them in the, bigger discussions. And then the work with the teachers, it started with the 2017, we did 2 retreats for teachers and staff, 3 days and 2 nights, immersion into positive psychology. And I will say that was primarily about them as people, because teachers are people. Some kids won't believe that, right? You think they live in their classroom under the desk. But learning that this is people first and then as teachers second. So some teachers want a manual, just tell me what I do. And I just want to know the right thing. Others want to use their creativity and their strengths and their curiosity. And so it is always a hard balance to figure out what do we expect for everybody to know, learn, the knowledge, skills, and abilities you talk about in curriculum. And then what are they expected to do in the classroom? So that's a constant, I would say, kind of juggling of, making sure new teachers come in, new teachers leave, that whole body of knowledge leaves with those teachers. So it's just constantly making sure that we're using the same language is really a key piece. Calling things the same thing and, using the same language that they're using in the C classes and the other classes. And then the parent work, I will tell you, has been really, really hard to do over the past few years. And so that's something we're bringing back into our thinking for this year, now that parents are allowed, I mean, it's crazy to say they're allowed to be back in the schools where their children go, but kind of building building their interest and knowledge into the work as well is key. We've done for many years before COVID in our entire lower school, parents would come in and do one of the seed lessons with their children. It was the most well-attended event we host at the school. Every kid had one or two parents with them for this seed event. So parents are so interested in this information. And, I will say again, the past few years has just been hard to find the venue and the time. And so that is something that we are really focusing on for this coming year, and finding ways to bring in our families, parents, guardians, caregivers, grandparents. There's a wide variety of people who are interested.
I love that you are able to reflect on what you're doing well and on what you're working on. And I think that's something that our audience will start to recognize is a real trait of someone who's working on whole school mental health and well-being, that we are a work in progress. It's never going to be set. And there's always something new to add. There's always something that you can drop that you've been doing that you're going to move on from. And so you are really practicing what you teach at the school.
I hope so. And I do think that is what makes this kind of work sometimes difficult for boards of education or trustees or strategic plans. We actually do have a piece of our strategic plan around educational excellence in our SEED program. And so thankfully that gives us the, credibility, or, gives us that backbone to come back to. But a lot of strategic work is around buildings and having something that you can check and be done. And this kind of work, it's hard. We can gather metrics and we can gather data, but it's never, ever finished. And so that's not as appealing to people who like to check boxes and build buildings and have things, more clear cut. So it is harder, but worth it. Mm-hmm.
So Sharon, you talked about training of teachers around the science of wellbeing, and there's obviously formal instruction. Is there other ways that teachers can learn about the science of wellbeing that they can use, like you say, they are people, so they can use for their own selves before then transferring across to students?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, and I think what we've tried to do with our professional development is give teachers tastes, and we refer to our faculty and staff as colleagues because we like to not have to say faculty and staff, and so all colleagues are given a taste of certain things, mindfulness or growth mindset, emotional agility, emotional awareness. And so a lot of people have gone on to do their own research and become curious and delved into things, deeper levels, and, read the books and the podcasts and gone to the conferences. I'm really hoping to bring a lot of people out to Vancouver for the International Positive Psychology Conference this summer. That's one of my goals. We have traveled to some of the others. We've been to Australia. And so, I think using the resources that are out there, and, particularly summer is a nice time for schools to do that. So I do think we are lucky to have a pretty wide or a lot of available conferences and trainings to go to as well outside of school. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, you did. Okay. I'm wondering, though, obviously the school has such a large focus around wellbeing, and obviously significant budget put towards it as well if you're traveling to international conferences on the other side of the world as a collective. But despite the focus and teachers coming to the school knowing about this, are there any that still are hesitant to be involved?
Yeah, Yep, there definitely are. And I think that's actually one of the questions we will pose to Adam Grant next week about, his work on burnout talks about mismatched values can be a big factor. And, our data through our Flourishing at School program showed quite a bit of burnout in our colleagues this past year. And so I do think, I think we have to talk about that, figuring out what the school values and exactly what that means. Sometimes we're talking about the same thing and people think they don't believe in it because they hear, for example, positive emotions, and they think, well, that means you think I have to be smiling all the time. And, some of that toxic positivity that people talk about. And so, I think there's people some of our teachers who talk about that and say, well, I can't possibly, smile and be joyful every day or every minute of every day. And so I sometimes think having the one-on-one conversation is where I've had the best results. I don't want to say talking people into it, but helping them understand. And then we've moved forward. I think sometimes there is just miscommunication or misunderstanding. And then, there are perhaps some people over the years who've thought, this isn't for me. I want to teach calculus or chemistry or math or writing. And, I don't think this is that important. And, I guess the line we're drawing in the sand at this point is that we want excellent teachers, but our definition of educational excellence that's part of this strategic plan includes individual well-being, collective well-being, and student achievement, which includes arts, athletics, and academics. So that's been made very clear what the definition is. And so I think as we continue to move forward, again, post-COVID, I do think we are being much more clear in our language and our expectations when we're hiring and when we're doing evaluations of our colleagues to be able to look at how people are using what they've learned in these professional sessions in their work. So.
Yeah, that's great because you've already answered my follow-up question, which was going to be how do you convince some of those naysayers or people who have those objections and, like you say, going on that journey one-on-one with them often and beating them over the head with a pos-psych textbook.
Right. Yeah, that doesn't work.
Not quite.
Yeah, no. I do find that, just talking about how we got here, kind of the journey, sometimes when we're in the midst of this work and I'm going to the conferences and I'm listening to all the podcasts, you do get in your bubble, your echo chamber. And so I think it is so important to have those conversations and explain, well, we started here and this was the next step. And you remember that strategic plan where we said we were going to do this. And then remember Dr. Adler came and sometimes it's just kind of reminding people who've been around for a while of the journey. But, teachers and those of us in education, I think we get a little cynical because there are things that have come and gone cyclically. And, some teachers back in 2017 were like, well, we'll just ride this out and see what the next new thing is. And so far, even with a change of head of school, this is what we're sticking with, maybe tweaking language, but really sticking with the ethos that individual collective well-being achievement is how we define educational excellence.
Yeah, terrific.
I love that you talked about it being right in the hiring. So it's from day one, when you join our team, this is part of what you expect. So I'm thinking again of a school that's beginning this journey or a school that's maybe not got the money to come to Vancouver and do all the conferences. Yeah. Can you think of kind of that low hanging fruit thing? This is something that we did that worked well, it was fairly simple, and it made a difference. Do you have something like that you could recommend?
Sure. There's a couple of things. I mean, I definitely do think, character strengths and knowing strengths is one of, I think, I would say, low-hanging fruit, from a lot of work that's been done. And so having people do that right away, whether they use the VIA survey, some people like the Gallup. We have people who come in maybe with one or the other, or just do the VIA. And so we do that with all our new colleagues as kind of one of our first intros into flourishing and positive education, just so they get that common language and they see it around the school. And I do think a lot of teachers and educators gravitate to that idea about knowing their strengths and knowing how they're using them. And then that's such an easy next conversation into flow and meaning and purpose and some of the other, next level pieces. So I do think that is one that we have found, really useful. And actually a tip I don't want to say stole, I learned from someone at a conference was to print out your strengths and keep them with your ID and your badge. And so, so I can have my ID at lunch and someone's like, oh, hope is one of your top strengths. That was one of my lowest strengths. And I know it sounds like that wouldn't happen, but it really does. And so kind of having those out there, and then the students do it as well. And then you can have those cross conversations. That's, I think, one of the easier things that I know a lot of schools have done and found really good success with.
Yeah, definitely something I've observed as well.
So you mentioned hope. What are your top strengths? I want to hear both of your strengths, because I don't know yours either, Jason.
Oh, so mine are hope, perspective. Actually, my T-shirt I have on right now, we taught a positive psychology class in 2020. And while we were virtual, we had T-shirts made with our top strengths. So I have hope on the back of my shirt. People think it's my name sometimes when I walk around. They yell hope. I'm like, no, it's not my name. Humor is another top one of mine. It's one of my favorites. Judgment. Some people refer to as open-mindedness. They like that better, but judgment is the term from the VIA strengths. And social intelligence. Those are my top 5.
Well, your first 3 are the same first 3 as mine. So hope, perspective, and humor. And then my other 2 are creativity and appreciation of beauty.
I think
what would be the chances of having those top the same? That is mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, I can't remember which one is the top, but it doesn't really matter, right? They're all much of a muchness. So, yeah. But
I'm in there.
No wonder we get along so well, Sharon.
I know, that's right.
I overlap with your humor on that Venn diagram, and then I'm largely into creativity and love of learning. And I wouldn't say, it's funny because forgiveness is at my top, and I'm always curious about that one because I always think, when am I actually having the chance to use this? But it does sit quite high with me, which I always find quite interesting.
You just need crappy friends.
I think
the other cool thing you just reminded me of when we first did the character strengths, and we should do it again, we did one of those. Well, it was called a Wordle, but it's not the game Wordle, where you would input all of the words into a machine, like a word cloud? And then it would word cloud. That was it. Yes. And among all of our faculty and staff, our colleagues, love was the biggest word. And it was just so cool to see, wow, people work in a school because they have love at the heart of what they're doing. It was just amazing to see that. Zest was one of the lowest, interestingly. think that's why sometimes the rowdy kids, kind of annoy us in class.
That's why I was annoying at school, because zest is my number 5.
Yeah. I mean, and that's funny.
It's interesting too, because often the students like to be treated like adults, but they don't want to do the same stuff as their teachers. And so it's really nuanced, right? It's not just as simple as this is a word everybody understands, let's use it, because if the teachers are doing it, then that's not maybe cool enough for the students. Right. And it does take a lot of effort.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But yeah, I think that's one of the main lessons. And one of the others would be if you're going to take 200 people to do a 3-day, 2-night retreat, they need a lot of notice. And, we gave, I think, about 8 months notice, but I think we should have had at least a year. So I know that sounds like very, very specific and in the weeds, but we definitely heard, that's, we just, for schedules and kids, and we covered the cost of, whatever people needed to make it work. But, that's, if you're going to try to do one of those immersive trainings, it does take a lot of planning, and you need a long runway to get up to that. So.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the learnings that we got from a project we ran actually with Justin Robinson, who we'll hopefully have on the podcast shortly as well, who was at Geelong Grammar School.
Yep.
But we're doing a project with over 20 independent schools in Victoria. And that was part of the learnings. It was, hey, if you want to do a big intervention like we were doing, you really have to give teachers and the school, like the previous year when they're doing their planning for the full year, you got to give them that much notice in order to, plan around, okay, well, I need to deliver all this other stuff. How am I also going to fit this other thing in? So because, they're doing all their planning before the year starts, you got to get to it at that stage, right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. I was just joking with one of our history teachers at lunch, because she has her assignments through January 2023 already populated in our system. And I was like, what's going to happen if, there's a snow day? Or she's like, don't say that. I was like, okay. Teachers love what they do, and they plan, and they look ahead, and they build on lessons. And so it does really throw people. If you just think, oh, well, we're going to take this day and do that, or we're going to remove this one. And, I think within reason we can do that. But if you do want something to fall well with teachers, the most notice possible, and have a lot of conversations and explain it well, and, do good communication around it.
Yeah, all good tips.
So, Sharon, I have a question, because something I'm always very interested to know from schools that I work with is if everything worked, if you got it right, and the parents got it, and the kids got it, and the staff got it, everybody was feeling good and functioning well. If you didn't have a test like our tests through Flourishing at School, how would you know? What would feel or look or sound different at Shipley School if you were getting it right? How would I, walking in, recognize, they got it?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've been thinking a lot about that with our conversations around culture. And I do think something that we've noticed, and this has been out there in the social psychology literature for a while, but a way that human beings connect is often around complaining. So, kind of the water cooler, the gossip, and it's kind of how you make your first forays oftentimes into social groups. And so I think if we have gotten this right, we will have replaced a lot of that, and people will have other ways to connect that will not just go down to the kind of lowest common denominator, because that's, you run into someone at the store, the weather, it's something we tend to do. And so that would be kind of my I think something you could visibly see and hear that might be different. I also do think, and this would be part of the metrics of what we measure, but, the anxiety in students would be lower. It would be measurably lower. And, we find what I think is a very interesting pattern of students with very high well-being and also very high anxiety, which should be antithetical in, what positive psychology hopes for. But you do find in schools like ours, and I know there's other schools and systems that have found this too. So I think if we could really decrease that, because some of it is contagious and some of it is organic and, a person absolutely suffers, and others, other types of anxiety, I think people get drawn into. And I think that I guess it relates to sort of the complaining and connecting around who's the most stressed and who hasn't slept. And so I would hope you would hear less of that, less of the, I have too much, I have this, and, I didn't sleep for 4 days, and those things that, I think kids think kind of the badge of honor. It's like adults being busy, and kids, it's like, we have so much work. And then I do think in the classrooms, one of the goals that I think all of the schools doing this work have is that you would want to see integration of flourishing well-being across classrooms in a really authentic way. So we've taught it to students, we've taught it to adults, and then there's this synergy where you can see things coming up in a math class or a Spanish class or a first grade, and it would feel authentic. But you could also say, oh, that's a teacher, using meaning and purpose to help kids understand the civics lesson. And so I do think that is our big aspirational goal with kind of curriculum and content. So those would be the things I would think you would find.
Thank you. Those
Welcome.
Certainly are clear. They're clear metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that you still kept a little bit of aspirational. Your hope, your strength of hope shines through because you've always got the next level on your mind. And I'm sure that's why you're such a gift to Shipley and the program. Do you call it a program?
Yeah, not really. I think we just call it I don't know what we call it, because people do ask that, well, what is this? I'm like, well, it's a practice and it's a philosophy. I would say more than anything.
The idea of it as a philosophy, because as you were saying at the beginning of the show, if it's a program, it can be the flavor of the month and go away. And this is something that needs to not go away.
Yeah. Agreed. And, Justin and David from Geelong would often say, we just want it to be called education, right? Not positive education. And I think, I think that's what we all hope, that, well-being at the heart of education, as, was one of their mantras. I think that's what we're striving for. That's what the philosophy is about, that, you do find that synergy in that Venn diagram where well-being and achievement, go together so much that you can't take them apart anymore, that people know how to do both of those things for themselves and for their students. Oh.
Sharon, I am conscious of time because Tamara actually does have to rush immediately after we record with you for real world stuff. But if listeners are, I think a lot of our listeners are going to have a love of learning, like Tamara does as one of their top strengths. So if you could recommend, one or two books or podcasts that you're listening to at the moment that you think our listeners might find valuable, given they're interested in this topic of school mental health, what would they be?
So I do listen to a lot of Brene Brown just because I am on the administrative team, and, working with adults is something that is not something I was trained to do. So I feel like I'm always shoring up the leadership and, working with all of us. So I listen to Brene's podcasts and Adam Grant with the work life. And again, because I didn't study organizational psychology, I'm trying to learn as much of it as I can around the work with adults. They're my two big ones I go to. And then I do listen. Couldn't say I always listen. I would need to say I listen to Nick Holton's because he's my colleague and he's had some amazing guests on that I think we need to make sure people hear, because they've really dug into what this looks like in schools too. So from such a wide range of fields, which I always find the most interesting, going to like a positive psychology conference when there's organizational people and clinical and healthcare and medicine and education. I think the more interdisciplinary we all can become, the better educators we are. So I like listening to a lot of different things that maybe aren't necessarily education, but I think they bring such good information.
Yeah, I think that's terrific, and definitely agree with the Adam Grant podcast. Listeners could probably tell early on I've got a bit of a professional crush on Adam. We've been calling out on our other podcast for him to come on as a listener for a while, but I don't think he listens to that podcast. So any hints or any nudges for Adam when you see him next week, and hey, there's this great Australian couple that would love to have you on that podcast. That would be terrific. But I'll pass over to Tamara to wrap up in a moment. But one thing that you mentioned there, which I think is super important, is that transdisciplinary approach. Because, if anything, I see some schools that are going like full hog down, say, just the positive psychology route, and that's all they're doing. They're missing out on a lot of really great and very well evidenced strategies that they could be using to improve mental health conditions or the condition of mental health for both staff and students. So there is a danger of taking one lens, because then, you've got one hammer in your toolkit, and every problem that you see is going to look like a nail. And so really we need to be bringing in, if you're not building your own knowledge around other areas like you are, Sharon, which is very admirable. Love of learning must be your sixth strength, I reckon. Bring in people who have, different skill sets to your own, or different views around mental health.
Yep. Agreed. Yeah, it's so important.
So Sharon, before we wind up, I want to just throw it out there. Was there anything we didn't ask you that you think we should have asked you today?
I don't think so. I mean, one of the things, since we're specifically talking about mental health, that I didn't really touch on is the universal screening that we do of our students, 6th through 12th grade. And I'm happy to talk more about that. That's kind of a hour-long session in and of itself, but I do think some schools shy away from that type of screening. We do screen depression, anxiety, and PERMA Plus, using that framework from the Flourishing at School program. So I do think that's a huge piece of what we do, is that screening and looking at students holistically and looking at our aggregate data and what grades have certain scores over time. And then the individual students, we get a window into their world often before there's a crisis. So I do think, in the big picture of mental health, there's, I'm a psychologist and a social worker. So, my original training was not in positive psychology or flourishing. And I do think, for those who are working more in that lane, you can use these things to complement each other. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We're not in camps that are fighting each other. I've gotten that question from schools. Well, if you bring in positive psychology, should we just get rid of the counselors? I'm like, no. So, I do think that screening of all students is so important. And it has been something we've been doing for 7 or 8 years at this point. So we could give a lot of tips and advice around that.
Well, I'm going to take you up, and Jason, we're going to bring you back for the next hour in another episode. But I think that was a great way to close out and just say, yeah, we're looking at identifying challenges, we're looking at building students up, and we're looking at the organizational context. Sounds like Shipley's running a pretty wonderful program, and thank you for spending an hour of your time to share a bit about it with Jason and I today.
Thank you.
We hope that our listeners enjoyed this, and we want to remind everybody that you can also watch this on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. I always say Flourish DX, Flourish Diagnostics.
That's Flourish DX. It is. You got it correct, Tamara.
I am willing to be wrong because my mistake tolerance is high, but whatever it is, watch us on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. We're going to share some clips on LinkedIn, so we hope that if you're listening, you'll reach out and connect with myself and Jason and Sharon on LinkedIn. And we'd love to continue the conversation. If you have questions for us, we'd be happy to answer them there. And that is it for this episode. We're going to catch you on the next episode. And until then, keep flourishing at school and in life.
You've been listening to the Flourishing at School podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on whole school mental health, follow Flourish DX School on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Flourishing at School podcast at www.flourishingatschool.com.